fellow members of the National Society Descendants of American Farmers. My name is Glenn Martin, and this is Renee Hamilton, and we are the military co-directors for your society. I want to welcome you to the second Zoom meeting dedicated to honoring individuals who served in the U.S. Armed Forces during the Vietnam War era. The United States Vietnam War commemoration was established to recognize the men and women in uniform during that time, whether they served at home or abroad. And as a commemoration partner, the NSDOAF is proud to be holding these Zoom meetings to implement the goals of the program. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our President National, Janice Regal, and the board members, directors, and ambassadors who have joined us today. Renee and I are pleased that our society leadership is once again so well represented. Thank you. We are being joined today by 5 NSDOAF members who served during the Vietnam War era, 4 with the U.S. Army, and 1 with the Air Force. We are again pleased to have both officers enlisted, as well as both men and women. Thank you. We invite our honorees and attendees to remain for a question and answer session after all our honorees have spoken, if they would like to do so, because we'd like to limit our honorees to 5 to 10 minutes each to discuss their service, just so we have time to get everyone in. But afterwards, I'm sure people want to hear more. So I'll now yield the floor to my co-director, who will introduce our first honoree.
Good evening, everyone. It is an honor to be here and present our first honoree, Colonel Matthew J. Barlow, Jr., United States Army Medical Corps, retired. Colonel Barlow holds national number 1014. He served for 22 years from 1965 to 1987. Sir, if you will please share with us a few memories of your service during that time, as well as comments regarding your service to our nation.
Thank you very much for this honor, and thank you for allowing me to speak today. This is my connections to the Vietnam War era. I joined the Army Medical Corps in June of '65. I completed a rotating internship at Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center. At that time, as interns, we had to treat those soldiers who were evacuated from Vietnam through particularly Clark Air Force Base to Denver, and they came in body casts, which we got up at 4 in the morning and had to cut the body cast off to see which further treatment they needed. Many of them did not have arms or limbs. My wife, Nancy, volunteered at the hospital writing letters for injured soldiers to their loved ones. I completed my residency in pediatrics at Tripoli Army Hospital. My wife, Nancy, taught GED classes to soldiers waiting to be sent to Vietnam, and Nancy taught English as a second language to many Vietnam's women who were married to the American soldiers. Several Army Medical Corps friends visited us during their R&R in Hawaii. I served in the Department of Pediatrics at the 97th General Hospital in Frankfurt, Germany in '69. Many pediatric patients were children of fathers who were stationed in Vietnam. Many military personnel stationed there rotated back and forth from Germany to Vietnam at least 2 times. Worked in the pediatric department at William Beaumont Hospital in El Paso, 1972 to '76. I was sent TDY to Fort Indiantown Gap in 1965. I worked with 75. I worked with 25,000 Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees until they were processed and could be assigned a sponsor. Coordinated the needed additional medical services at Hershey Medical Center. My wife and I sponsored a 16-year-old Vietnamese teenager who came over during that time for over a year until he was settled on his own. Thank you.
Colonel Barlow, what do you have a specific memory of your service helping the Vietnamese that when you think of it makes you smile? Aside from your sponsoring, is there just a particular event that happened that you're proud to have been a part of?
Well, I met a number of Vietnamese doctors who came here and they resettled in different places and they all assimilated very well. So I was very happy to be able to be a part of that.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Colonel Barlow. My co-director will now introduce our second honoree.
Thank you, Renee. Our second honoree today is Patricia Thibodeau, NSDOAF member C314, who was an enlisted member of the United States Air Force, rising to the rank of technical sergeant. Pat, thank you for joining us today and allowing us to recognize your service. Could you please share a few memories about your service during the Vietnam War era and anything else you would care to relate about that time?
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. And I want you to know I blame it on my brother, the Marine, for me joining. He helped design the Atlas rockets that were used in the space program in the 50s. I had stood on the hill and watched the test firing in Huntsville, and I had met Dr. Von Braun, and I thought a life in that career field would be the most exciting thing in the world. So I determined to join the military as soon as I was old enough. Life had other plans. Work. And as I reviewed the options on how to keep my children in shoes and food on a single female income, a family friend who happened to be an Air Force recruiter suggested I think about changing my bank teller high heels for a parade ground low quarters. And so I took my first ever plane ride to San Antonio, Texas for basic training. I was a dorm chief for 52 women. I think it was because I was 26 years old and had 2 children of my own. My ASVAB scores had been high enough that I had my choice of career fields, but I asked that they put me where they needed me most. And so I became the first woman in the Air Force to teach air traffic control radar repair. My mother was not happy with my enlistment and didn't speak to me for a year. But that recruiter stayed my friend for the rest of his life because I think he saved mine. 4 years later, I transferred off active duty and into the Air Force Reserve. And I wound up in California teaching air cargo specialist. Now, I want to mention here that I never had a problem with misogyny, but at the time there were so few women in the service that there were no restroom facilities for women in the hangar at Norton. Now, we had a cardboard sign that said occupied, and it was supposed to be kept in the desk just outside the latrine door. But the sign never seemed to be there when we needed it. So the only other woman in the crew, Ellen, became my battle buddy. An assignment to Kadena Air Base in Japan wound up being the highlight of my career. I helped with the last few baby airlift flights that came from Vietnam. Many of those orphans found their forever home in coastal Texas cities, living productive lives among other Vietnam refugees. I married a Marine. We were stationed in Tennessee. I transferred into the Navy Reserve. 2 years later, we were back in Texas. My commander at the Dallas Navy Air Station said I was the only person in the Navy Reserve who wore an Air and Space Commendation Medal on my rack that I had been awarded during my tenure at Carswell Air Force Base, which is now JRB in Fort Worth. All of my Lineage Society chapters are Vietnam commemorative partners, and I have the honor to serve as the main contact point for each. I have been the coordinator for 8 years with the city of DeSoto, and now for 2 years in Canton to celebrate all our Vietnam vets. This year, at the 50th anniversary, one of the gentlemen told me that I did not deserve to wear this pin because I had never been in country. He was 6'4" and weighed 300 pounds, and I did not argue with him. We all know the president said that it didn't matter where you served or how, as long as you served honorably, that's all that matters. And I look back on the 14 years I spent in service, and I know that mission first. Even though I wasn't in country, there are thousands of lives that were positively affected by my choices. Now, my career choice is carried over into my civilian life. I have earned my Bachelor of Science and my Master of Science using veteran benefits. I have had wonderful jobs for the past 40 years, most of them classified in nature. I have lived or worked in all but 4 of our 50 states. My husband is a retired Army Guard with 2 combat tours in the Middle East. My son is a retired Army combat paratrooper, twice recommended for the Silver Star. My daughter has an MS in hospital management and is a NICU nurse in Fort Worth. My oldest grandson is recently out of the Marine Corps and pursuing a BSME degree. My youngest grandson this year joined the Army and is in training for combat med. My middle grandson is active duty Navy with the submarine force. My only granddaughter is a physician assistant in the terminal cancer field. And even though my mom hated it, I think my 14 generations of soldier ancestors are proud. And I'd do it all again without reservation in a heartbeat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat. I also did a service swap when I got out of the Navy and joined the Army National Guard. So I know us enlisted folks are always looking for the best deal. Okay, thank you very much. Renee will introduce our next honoree.
Our third honoree is Lieutenant Colonel Donald K. Wallace. Colonel Wallace holds national number 1267 and did 3 tours in Vietnam during the war. If you will please share with us a few memories of your tours of duty in Vietnam, as well as comments regarding your service.
Just like Colonel Barlow, my time really began in 1965 when I was a medical intern. I planned on doing, I applied to the Berry Plan and planned on doing a combined residency, 1 in medical medicine and 1 in public health. The Army said they'd give me 3 years off to do 1, but not 6 years off. So the action was Vietnam, so I took a public health residency and headed for Johns Hopkins, where I did my PH, where the surgeon of the Special Forces and actually a Vietnamese physician was training, doing his MPH. I had some different interests. They wanted me to, I was in the international health and they wanted me to head for India, but I said, no, the actions of Vietnam, I'm going there. So I did a short tour as a American Medical Association volunteer physician in Can Tho, South Vietnam. I left that, came back. I told them I'm sort of different, that I wanted to do a master's program in economics. So they sent me out to the Johns Hopkins Graduate Department of Economics, where I spent the second year of my residency and was working towards that master's when I got picked off the State Department to go down to Washington. And while I was there, they picked me off to go over to Vietnam and put my economics background to work with the State Department, USAID. So I did that. And I'm probably one of the few folks you'll have who got his draft orders to Saigon, but I did. That was 1969. And when I finally decided to pick those draft orders up, I had 4 days to make Fort Sam. So first day I flew to Washington, D.C., picked up a wife and 2 children, and drove in the next 3 days to Fort Sam in San Antonio and got there on time to join the Army. I was lucky enough because of my background to have been able to pick my tour in Vietnam before I joined the military. I wanted to be the chief of preventive medicine under Colonel Creighton Abrams with the Military Advisory Command Vietnam, and they gave me that tour. But because I'd cut short my consultancy with the State Department, I had actually a colonel who was the same old Special Forces guy who's pissed off at me for cutting my consultancy short and joining the Army. And they cut my tour. And so I spent 2 years at Fort Jackson, South Carolina as preventive medicine officer, and was about ready to, had about 6 months to go before I got out. But the tour I wanted in Vietnam came open. I knew the guy. And I drove to Washington and told them I wanted to go to Vietnam. And they said, well, we'll send you over if you'll take a 3rd year in the Army, in the military. So I signed up for a 3rd year in the Army and got my Vietnam tour, which was as chief of preventive medicine with the Military Advisory Command Vietnam. And I had sort of because of my background, I had sort of a interesting view. For example, in my first tour in Canton, they took me to dinner the first night and said, this hotel is ours. The VC had the hotel next to us. Well, you know where I didn't go during that entire tour. And it's funny things happen along the line. I found out the CIA guy, station chief in Canton, had a girlfriend who I was being seen. Once I caught on to that relationship, I had no trouble traveling Vietnam when I wanted to during even that first tour. But to come back to really the military side, something haunts me. I was standing at Thompson Air Base across from 3rd Field one day, and I could see a helicopter coming in. I knew where he was going. He was going to the landing pad at 3rd Field. And as I watched the helicopter come in, I could see there were 2 stretchers. And as the helicopter approached, I could see there were 2 guys on those stretchers. And as the helicopter landed, I could see that neither guy had either feet or boots or feet. And that's really the horror of war, that we should never think of the glory, think of the guys who are really out there doing it, just like Colonel Barlow picked up. Not we soft-siders like the docs who were back behind a bit. I love Vietnam. I love the Vietnamese people. They're a great bunch. They're hardworking, they're literate, they're energetic, friendly, all the things you'd want. But there's some anomalies that struck out to me, and you can cut me off anytime you wish. As a young doc doing actually the last time I practiced medicine per se was in Canton, we used to go to one of the steakhouses. They had the Chicago, the LA, the New York, and heck, I suppose they had a Dallas steakhouse too. Well, when in the military, I'd go back and inspect those same places, and this was 67, 69, 71. So 4 years later, I would go and inspect it, for example, in Chicago, and you'd see it was on the Mekong River, and you see the water coming up inside of a cistern in the middle of the room, and you see a turd floating around. You see a fly land the turd, you jump up and fly over and land on the steak that's being cooked. That was, there you go. That was Vietnam sanitation. Well, you go to a prisoner of war camp, and they have a big long pier going out into looks like a pond. And the pier actually is their outhouse. So they go out to the end of the outhouse and crap in their pond, and way back at the very base and around the entire pond, you see them fishing for catfish. So they're going to eat, they're feeding catfish at one end and eating in the catfish in the other, pulling the catfish out for eating on the other. And so you get some interesting views of Vietnam. I recall the first session when one of the fellows mentioned stopping at a bordello in the Philippines. Well, you know, Vietnam was an interesting place. I had a chance to inspect the records at MACV, And the VD rate in Vietnam, or actually it's gonorrhea clap, we call it then, was over 1,000 cases per 1,000 men per year. So you know what was going on. The Vietnamese are also a very friendly group. I could go on a bit, but we won't go on too much farther than that. I got a bit bored with the MACV job, so I joined the Airborne Command, their crack combat unit as an advisor. And those guys are still my buddies. They're the hardcore, actually, they're the hardcore guys. But one of the things in Vietnam you could never turn your back on, just as a first night in Saigon in '67, they point out, we have this hotel, the VC have the hotel next to us, don't go there. Well, you could never quite be sure on whose side which Vietnamese was. For example, my own advisee with the MACV had been a tank commander for the Viet Minh in 1954, and he came south and switched sides and became my advisee for preventive medicine. And that was good. It worked out well. We got along well and everything, and I loved the tour. But that was always a problem. The other thing that happened in my time was the heroin epidemic. And I'm sort of a guy who will try things, and I decided before I went out that I'd try a little heroin. And I got out there, and about the second day I was there, they called a big meeting out at USRV about the heroin epidemic. And they had 400,000 men in the country at that time. And as Colonel Barlow can probably say, you were in country, right, Colonel Barlow? You're muted, okay.
I never was in Vietnam, per se.
I'm sorry?
I never was in
Okay, I'm sorry.
Vietnam.
Okay, well, where's my point here? So what was my point with calling it? We were in the country looking at the disease rates. Sure, the heroin epidemic. So we had whole units being disabled there from heroin. And Creighton Abrams was a smart guy, and he says, our rate in Vietnam has never gone above 5%. Well, actually, it's probably 15 or 20%. And the issue was that every guy had to get out of heroin before he came home, so he wouldn't be positive when they tested out. And they dropped their rate to 5%. You were cold turkey out of heroin and came on home, and who knows what contribution you made when you got on home. But that was the Vietnam I knew. And one of the things I knew after listening to the rates of infection after doing heroin was that was one thing I was never going to touch. And of course, I never have. I'm not going to toast myself right now, but still Vietnam was a very positive experience. I love the place, and I've been back there since and one more time. And in some ways, the Vietnamese are people that in a second life, I might say, let me go there, let me be one of them. I love Vietnam. Enough of that.
Thank you, Colonel Wallace. My co-director will now introduce, our next honoree. Yes.
Fantastic, Dawn.
Thank you, Renee. Our fourth honoree today is Marshal William Anderson, NSDOAF member number 1176. Marshal was a Specialist 4 in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War era. Marshal, thank you for joining us today and allowing us to recognize your service. Would you please share a few memories about your service during the Vietnam War era and anything else you would care to relate about that time?
Thank you, Glenn. I promised my wife I wouldn't say every time I was at a loss for words, so forgive me if I do that. I volunteered for the U.S. Army in November of 1972 as the war was winding down. I was at a total loss for a career. My father was an Air Force physician and a colonel at the time. My mother was a nurse, a professor of nursing in San Antonio, and had gotten the first PhD for an American in England when we had been stationed in London. My mother suggested that even though I had no intention of ever going into any kind of medical career, that I considered joining the Army for the physician assistant school. One of the reasons why I never considered becoming a physician was at the time you had to have passed the advanced math calculus courses, and I had no clue about how to pass anything above trigonometry in high school. So I volunteered, and they didn't have any slots for me until March, when the next basic training was due to start. So they called it delayed entry. I went active duty on March 19th and went to Fort Polk for basic training. The first platoon guide for my platoon didn't work out, so Sergeant Goldbach replaced him with me, and I asked Sergeant Goldbach why he had picked me, and he said, "You're the second largest guy in the platoon." That took me down a notch. I had gotten guaranteed for medic training after basic training, and transferred back to Fort Sam Houston for advanced individual training. They started with a basic medic course, then a combat medic course, 91 Bravo. And then, as I had been guaranteed, I went to 91 Charlie School, which was 9 months, and qualified me for the licensed nurse, practical nurse, or back then they called it licensed vocational nurse, which I passed at the same time. During my rotations at Fort Sam Houston at Brooke Army Medical Center, I went through the burn center. And at the time, there were very few nurses who would tolerate taking care of burn patients. It was a pretty bad duty. But because I was interested and never turned down volunteer, even though I've been told before basic training, never volunteer for anything, I volunteered for everything that came up and never regretted it. So after I passed the 91 Charlie course, I was assigned to the burn unit at Fort Sam Houston Brooke Army Medical Center, which was run by the U.S. Army Institute of Surgical Research, and spent the rest of my active duty enlistment initially for 3 years at the burn ward. I was also volunteered for the evacuation, the aeromedical evacuation team, which went all over the country and sometimes all over the world to pick up burn patients, and evacuated and transported burn patients back to the burn unit, which was always a relief from the rotating schedule. As a nurse on the ward, you never knew when the call would come in, and you would be taken off of the duty schedule and sent out to pick up a patient. So it had its advantages. After I separated from the Army, I never did get into the physician assistant training, because as the war had already wound down, they were looking to get rid of people, not trying to re-enlist us. So there was no incentive to enlist without a guarantee that I would go to PA school. So after I separated from active duty, I was called by the physician assistant training program in Houston, and they were desperate for any kind of American volunteers to join their program. And so I went ahead and joined, and 2 years later, I was a physician assistant. But my wife at the time told me that I would never be happy being a physician assistant, that I should go back to medical school. So I checked, and it turned out that I no longer had to pass calculus to get in. So I applied and was able to get into medical school at Texas. Now I'm going to block on it. I'm going up on my lines. But anyway, I graduated from medical school in 1985. And like one of my colleagues here, Dr. Wallace, I later earned a Master of Public Health and became a specialist in occupational medicine, which I've practiced ever since. The other thing that I wanted to mention was I went into the active reserve after I separated from regular duty. While I was a student the first year, I had time on my hands and not very much money, so I went with the active reserve at the 273rd Medical Detachment in Tomball, which is well known in some circles as one of the demonstration projects for the Military Assistance and Safety and Traffic program, where we carried on the dust-off tradition for civilian highway accidents, evacuating victims from remote areas and bringing them back to tertiary trauma medical centers back in Houston. That's, I think that's pretty much it.
Thank you very much, Marshall. We appreciate that. And my co-director, Renee, will now introduce our final honoree of the day.
Our fifth and final honoree today is Henry Elvin Schoenfeld II, who served as an officer in the U.S. Army from 1969 to 1973. Mr. Schoenfeld, please tell us, sir, a little bit about your service during the Vietnam War era, including your rank, if you'd like. I know I keep poking about that, but so we can address you properly for your service.
Thank you for inviting me today. I apologize for being late. I was having a few computer problems. But first of all, I need to correct you because I was not commissioned. So I'm not a commissioned officer.
All right.
My story begins as a child because my dad was in the service, and therefore I'm an Army brat. I went to kindergarten in Yokohama, Japan. I went to first grade at Fort Hood, Texas. Went second, third, fourth grade in the Canal Zone with my dad. My dad, of course, got out of the military. In 1967, I had a congressional nomination to attend the United States Military Academy at West Point, but I was not selected. As you might know, it's a very competitive field to get into, and I decided to go in the Army ROTC program because Vietnam was still in full swing. In fact, I believe that was the year that we had the major Tet Offensive. So the military was pretty active at that point in time. So again, I enlisted in 1969 in the Army ROTC program. I was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia for basic training for 6 weeks in that summer. The following summer, I went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma to do advanced Army ROTC training, then went back to the campus. I left the school for a period of time, and I ended up being assigned, or I took an assignment with the 321st Civil Affairs Group, the United States Army Reserve at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. And then I returned back to the school and again went back into the Army ROTC. I was involved, unfortunately, in a very large anti-war demonstration. I believe it was around 1973 in the spring. We were at an inspection by the colonel commanding the 4th Army in San Antonio. We had roughly 5,000 students chanting with flags and signage, and we had music coming from dorms behind us. We were on a parade field, my platoon, which was roughly 40 something cadets in the infantry branch, confronted with 5,000 protesters, anti-war protesters. We had the Austin Police Force show up, we had DPS show up, we had campus police show up. It was a pretty intimidating experience to go through, and that particular day I was acting platoon sergeant, so I was on the very front of the formation, right-hand corner, so I had a really good view of what was going on. It was very intimidating, but we managed to hold ranks and we were escorted off the field, but still it was a very daunting and intimidating experience to go through. So in 1973, I was approached by an Army officer who said that the war in Vietnam was winding down and that they no longer needed me in the military. So he offered me 2 possibilities. He said, I will you can either transfer into an Army Reserve unit at Camp Mabry, excuse me, in Austin, or we will give you an honorable discharge. And so I said, if I transfer into an Army Reserve unit, then I have a 6-year commitment to look forward to with active duty every summer, correct? And he said, yes. And I said, well, I'm a young guy and I'm thinking I'd like to get married at some point in the near future and start a family. So I really would rather just take on thinking about it later, I decided I went down to the Army recruiter in downtown Austin, Texas, and asked them if I could enroll in a officer training, OCS, and I was informed that all the OCS classes were closed down because, again, Vietnam was winding down, they were cutting the military. So I also then asked if there was a availability to go to a helicopter school, thinking I might come back into the Army doing that. And he said, no, the same reason, since everything's winding down. So at that point in time, it appeared to me that it just wasn't in the cards for me to be in the military, and that the Lord was leading me in a different direction. So I did not serve on active duty, but I did serve the military, both in the Army Reserve and Army ROTC, and I loved the experience. I learned a lot about training and leadership, and I will always be dedicated to our country and our military and veterans. I'm also a life member of the American Legion for that purpose, so I get to hang out with veterans and really wonderful people. And that's my story. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your recollections with the society today. Now, to honor those Vietnam-era veterans who did not return home, we ask all of our attendees to please stand, if able, for the playing of taps. Today's honorees will receive a specially commissioned Vietnam War commemoration lapel pin. Also, we have a National Society Descendants of American Farmers commemorative partner certificate of valor that will be in the mail later this week, as well as other commemoration memorabilia. We appreciate your efforts to be here with us today. It's very important to us that we are able to commemorate you. And thank you again from myself for your attendance. And I'll pass it back now to my co-director. You're muted.
Oh,
Sorry.
uh,
I gotcha. You're unmuted.
thank you. If you will raise your glasses. On behalf of my military co-director, Renee Hamilton, as well as myself, the officers and members of NSDOAF, and a grateful nation, we thank today's honorees for their service. We greatly appreciate their presence here today, as well as all the officers and members of the National Society Descendants of American Farmers who joined us. Ladies and gentlemen, before we part ways today and enjoy our weekend, what's left of it, please join me in a toast. Let us remember all our men and women in uniform, past and present, home and abroad, in peacetime and wartime, all of whom gave some and far too many of whom gave all. To our veterans.
To our veterans.
Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn and Renee. I have everybody, I have your speakers spotlighted for questions and answers.